Thanks for joining us today, everyone, for our webinar titled Advanced Wind Technology, Elevated Wind Opportunities for the South. To ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout this presentation, but please type in any questions you may have in the questions box on your control panel, and our presenters will answer the questions at the very end of the presentation today. For those of you not familiar with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and I'd like to thank our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please consider joining us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, cleanenergy.org. Today's presenters will be Allie Brown, SACE Renewable Energy Associate, and Simon Mahan, SACE Renewable Energy Manager. Simon is responsible for overseeing the organization's promotion of clean energy with a focus on onshore wind energy within the region, offshore wind, and wind energy transmission. Simon specializes in policy advocacy, energy analysis, and stakeholder engagement. Previously, Simon worked as an advocate and analyst for an ocean conservation organization in Washington, D.C., addressing offshore wind economics, industrial energy efficiency, and mercury reduction policies. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree in political science at Missouri State University with minors in biology and communications. Simon is going to get us started today, so I will hand it over to him. Simon?
Great. Thanks, Erin. Good morning, everyone. As Erin mentioned, my name is Simon Mahan. I'm the Renewable Energy Manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Today, we've got some very exciting research that we're going to be sharing, talking about the new wind turbine technology in the South and what that opportunity means for us. Generally, we'll talk about the new turbine technology itself, and then Allie, my colleague, is going to go over some case studies that we've performed to show that wind energy resources in the South have been underestimated and that we can actually have sustainable wind energy development within that region. So moving on to our first slide here, I just want to give everybody a brief overview. If you haven't been keeping up with the wind industry, I strongly suggest you do. It's a very exciting industry. We've got over 62,000 megawatts of wind energy installed throughout the country, and that's enough to power approximately 16 million homes. And we have significantly more wind energy under construction right now. It's the 5th largest source of electricity generation in the United States, and it supports an awful lot of manufacturing jobs and service industry jobs associated with construction of the turbines, maintenance of the turbines, and other services associated with the turbines themselves. Here's a quick little chart showing how wind technology has been rapidly expanding across the United States. Even a decade ago, we were about the 10th of the size of what we are now. So we've increased the amount of wind energy in the United States by tenfold since 2004. And if you'll notice, we've had a bit of a hiccup since 2013 due to bickering in Washington, D.C. over a stable policy for wind energy. And I just want to note that wind energy is one of the few energy resources that emits no air pollution, it consumes no water, and it has no fuel price. So there's a lot of benefits to wind energy in addition to it being a good job creator as well. But what we've seen here is that across the United States, the wind development is predominantly happening everywhere except for the South. Here in the South, we do have one wind farm. It's the Buffalo Mountain Wind Project in Tennessee. It was partially constructed in 2000 and then expanded in 2004. And then we do have some new projects also in Puerto Rico that were installed just a few years ago. But predominantly, the development is happening in many other parts of the country, but not just here yet. But never fear, we are actually purchasing quite a bit of wind energy from other states. And so what happens is the utilities in our region are buying wind energy from these other states, and it's transmitted across transmission lines to get into our states. The unique part about this is the states that are buying wind energy are typically doing it because it is the lowest cost energy option. States like Georgia and Alabama are not mandated to purchase wind energy like some other states, but the reason why these companies buy wind is it's because it's the lowest price that they can get out of any generation resource. So it's reducing utility customer bills, and it's also providing a good energy resource for these utilities. Now, part of the reason why we wanted to talk about these new advanced turbines is because things have evolved pretty quickly over the past 5 years. Two major differences that are occurring are that the turbines are getting taller and the blades are getting longer. And what that does is it increases the output, the energy produced from a wind turbine. When you increase the amount of energy that comes out of a wind turbine, that lowers the cost and it makes it more price competitive with other sources of energy. Taller towers are capable of reaching better wind speeds. So if you think about it, you may be standing on the ground and not feeling any wind at all, but if you look up in the sky, you may see clouds passing by. Well, the clouds are passing by because the wind is greater at higher elevations than what they are at ground level. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Some of it may be because there's a lot of trees where you are, you're hiding behind a building or something or another. But the taller you can go with a turbine, the better wind speeds you can reach. With the blades, as the blades get larger, they're capable of capturing more wind energy, and that means they can translate that energy in the wind into an electrical energy through the generator. And if you think about it in terms of if it were like a sailboat, a sailboat that has a very, very small sail isn't going to travel very fast. But if you make the sails much larger, they'll capture more wind and they can go a lot faster and a lot further. So with these taller turbines and longer blades, we're seeing greater efficiencies with wind turbines, even from what we've seen 5 years ago, let alone to say a decade ago. And here's where the rubber hits the road. With the newer turbine technologies over the past decade, what we're seeing is that in lower wind speed areas, so in our areas here in the South, the cost of wind energy have substantially declined using the newer turbine technology. So if you look at the little chart off to the right here, we've got two kind of bars indicating a price from 2002 and 2003, and a different price in 2012 and 2013. And what that is showing is that wind speeds at 6 meters per second a decade ago cost a certain amount, about $90 per megawatt hour, or about 9 cents per kilowatt hour. But prices with the newer turbines have declined by about 39% in the past decade. And that's a substantial decline and making wind energy much more cost competitive in our region here. Additionally, with the newer turbines, it's increased the amount of area that you can develop with wind farms. And so there are new estimates that have been put out by the National Renewable Energy Lab that suggest we have substantial amounts of new wind energy potential that we didn't know we had before. And in part, it's due to, again, to the taller turbines, but also the longer blades. And these are substantially larger figures than what had previously been estimated. Currently, with the new Environmental Protection Agency Clean Power Plan, the new carbon rule, the EPA figures estimate a state like Mississippi has zero potential for wind energy. But with these new estimates using the new turbines, the new estimates show that Mississippi actually has over 25,000 megawatts. That's 25 gigawatts worth of wind energy potential, and it's because the blades are getting longer and the turbines are getting larger. Now, I want to kind of pick on Florida here. If you look at Florida, you may say, well, that doesn't look like an awful lot compared to the rest of the states, but the amount of wind energy that Florida may contain using these newer turbines is not small. It's about 1,500 megawatts. To put that in comparison, that's about the same amount of capacity as a nuclear reactor. So it's a substantial amount of renewable energy, and it only looks small because the rest of our states in the South have expanded their potential in such a great amount. So part of it is part of the change that we've seen is that the difference between the older turbines and the newer turbines. The other factor that you have to look at is the wind speed itself. And so what I wanted to do here was kind of highlight how important wind speed is when combined with the newer turbines. So if you look at an older turbine, the way developers typically look at it and utilities look at it is in terms of capacity factors. So if you have a 1 megawatt wind turbine and it has or a 1,000 kilowatt wind turbine and it has a 7% capacity factor, you multiply that 7% times the 1,000 kilowatts to get an average of how much energy it's going to generate every hour over the course of the year. So in this case, 7% times 1,000 would be roughly 70 kilowatts. Well, a 1 meter per second change for that turbine roughly doubles the amount of energy that it would put out. And that's a pretty significant change. And for folks that, including myself, that live on more of an English system, 1 meter per second change is about 2.2 miles per hour. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But what you'll notice is with the newer turbines, that same 1 meter per second change is a greater impact than what it is for the older turbines. So an older turbine might double in the amount of energy it produces, whereas a newer turbine would increase by about 1.5 times greater. So it's a significantly greater amount of output just based on a 2.2 mile per hour change. But it's not the same for each meter per second change. So from 6 meters per second to 7 meters per second, the older turbine and the newer turbine both increase by about 64% in their generation output. So it's a pretty big difference still between that 1 meter per second change. But what you'll notice, and here's the key part, what you'll notice is that the newer turbine is already about twice as good as the older turbine. So not only will you increase the amount of energy output by 1 meter per second, but also you can double the output in this kind of zone, the 6 meter to 7 meter per second zone with the newer turbine. So it's a huge step forward using these newer turbines. The bottom line here is that the newer turbines are about twice as good as the older turbines. That means the costs are going to come down a lot quicker and make it more available for areas like our region. Roughly, the new turbines can perform about the same with 1.5 meter per second wind speed slower. So it makes wind energy a lot more available to our region and to many of our states to actually develop these projects within our own footprint. And the turbines continue to improve. And so this is a key factor to remember, that we are not at the peak of the learning curve on these turbines just yet. And so as time goes on, we're going to see better and better prices with the wind turbines. For more visual folks out there, here's generally how you can look at the difference between a wind turbine output based on the older turbines and the newer turbines. So we have an older turbine here at representing the blue line, and these lines are called power curves. And generally what they indicate is energy output, which is on the y-axis, versus wind speed on the x-axis. So a wind turbine that is operating in a 6 meter per second regime, an older wind turbine, it's going to have a pretty significantly less energy output than a newer turbine. It's actually about half as good as the newer turbines. And as you can see, what's happening here is that the newer turbines are capable of ramping up much quicker and operating better in lower wind speeds than what the older turbines are. And in fact, they tend to reach very high levels of production quite early on in the wind speeds compared to the older turbines. So instead of it taking 13 meters per second in order to reach peak output, a newer turbine can actually reach peak output at 11 meters per second. So it's a huge difference. But what I want to really show you here is the difference between the 6 and the 7. This is kind of the sweet spot again. So at 6 meters per second, our older turbine is at about 200 kilowatts per hour, and the newer turbine is at about 400 kilowatt hours. That's a doubling effect in the same wind speed. So if you were to replace an older turbine that may be sitting in a 6 meter per second site with a newer turbine, you can roughly see about doubling of the energy output. And you have a similar effect in the 7 meter per second wind regime site. So here's where your wind turbine would be performing if it's an older one, and here's where it would be performing if it's a newer one. So you can see there's a huge difference in the energy output from the turbines just based on the newer technology. The final piece of the puzzle here is that the wind resource assessment maps that are generally available to the public really don't show the full story. And if you look at the image on the right-hand side here, you can see that there's two different pictures, but both pictures are actually showing the exact same kind of landscape. The difference is the image on the left has a poor resolution. So if you think about digital cameras, a decade ago, you know, a 2 megawatt, or sorry, a 2 megabyte digital camera was pretty good. But if you were to compare the image quality of that 2 megabyte digital camera to today's 20 megabyte digital cameras, you could see a substantial difference in the quality of information that the camera is able to put in and process. And so what you see here is that with better resolution, you can actually get better quality of information. And what's showing here is that the image on the left basically misses an entire mountain because the resolution is so poor. Something I really want to highlight here, though, is that the maps that are generally publicly available use a significantly worse resolution than the resolutions that I'm showing here. So imagine both of these images if they were just completely blacked out. And that's effectively what the resolution is for many of the maps that are available to the public to look and see if wind energy resources are viable. So the gist of all of this is that the areas characterized as low wind speed right now or undevelopable may actually be suitable for development. And it's in part because the newer turbine technology is available, but also better wind resource assessments are available to the private industry themselves. So with that, I've completed my portion of the presentation, and I'll be turning it over to Miss Allie Brown. Allie is our renewable energy associate in the Atlanta office for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. She has a focus on wind energy throughout the region. She provides assistance on wind energy through research, engagement with diverse stakeholders, policy advocacy, and implementation of local wind activities. Before joining SACE, Allie served on the executive board of the Sierra Student Coalition, UGA Beyond Coal, and was a student fellow for Georgia Youth for Environmental Solutions. In addition to environmental organizing, she was engaged in campus sustainability research. In 2012, she received a grant from UGA's Office of Sustainability to design and oversee student-based research that recommended actions to reduce UGA's energy consumption and increase the use of renewable energy on campus. Allie attended the University of Georgia and received her Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and minor in Ecology in May 2013 and has worked with SACE ever since then. Allie?
Great. Thanks so much, Simon. I think Simon set us up so well to dive into the second half of this report, which is looking at 5 low wind speed case studies. So what Simon already showed is that the Southeast is really ready for wind energy development with advanced turbines, but what we're finding is that these resource maps don't always reflect the potential. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare wind speeds from NRail's popular resource assessment maps. You can see below, you can easily access them online and it's open to the public. So we're going to compare these maps to available data that we have from particular wind farm sites. And the big takeaway from this that we're finding is that in most case studies, actual performance of the wind turbines is much greater than what we can determine by just looking at the wind resource assessment maps. So let's go into the case studies. So our first one here is Buffalo Mountain Wind Farm. It's located in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and it's currently the Southeast's first and only large-scale wind farm. TVA began this project in 2000 with 3 turbines, but then a developer called Invenergy came in and installed 15 in 2004, and those are currently the turbines that are operating and producing electricity. It's a total of 27 megawatts, and it serves TVA customers. And what we found is it's been, a really successful wind project. It powers approximately 3,400 homes a year. And the success of this wind farm, we're going to go into the maps next, are contrary to looking at what wind speeds we're finding from the maps. So on your right over here is the Tennessee average annual wind speeds developed by NRail. It's at 80 meters, which is about the same hub height as the wind turbines. So what we did was we took this map and continued to zoom in until we could try to locate the Buffalo Mountain Wind Farm. So this oval right here is where the wind farm is located. And while it's hard to gauge and determine, we found that from using the map and looking at the color chart here, the best prediction we could come up with is about 4 to 5 meters per second for average annual wind speeds. But let's take a look at the actual wind farm to see where we find the wind speeds to be. So luckily we have data from Buffalo Mountain Wind Farm to see what it actually generated. And from there, we can kind of work our way over to see what the wind speeds are. So we found that in 2012, the wind farm generated 48,000 megawatt hours from these 15 turbines. And each turbine is 1.8 megawatts. And, you know, Simon did a great job of explaining capacity factors. And we were able to break that down to determine a 20% capacity factor, and the average hourly output would then be 360 kilowatts because we took 20% of 1.8 megawatts. Now what we can do is use the power curve from the turbine. The turbines was a Vestas V80 1.8, and try to figure out what the actual wind speeds are. So let's look at the average hourly input, which we already determined at 360 kilowatts, be right about over here, and go over. And we found that based on the turbine power curve, the site is achieving about right here, 6 meters per second. So as we already discussed, a change in 1 to 2 meters per second can greatly change the output that the wind farm produces in a year. So let's go and look at what the NREL map was predicting just by looking at that assessment. If we're looking here at 5 or 4 meters per second and we go up to look at the output, it would place the wind farm at around 100 kilowatts, way below. And by using this assessment, it might not even be a good idea to develop this wind farm. And the capacity factor greatly increases from around 5 to 10%. So actual output is at least double what the map would predict. Our next case study, let's go on over to Rhode Island. This is Narragansett Bay Commission's wastewater treatment plant. I actually had the chance to see these wind turbines about a year ago, and they're up and spinning and look great. So these are 3 large-scale turbines installed in 2012, and they're performing really well, producing 6,700 megawatt hours of electricity in the first year. So let's take a look at the map. This one's a little bit easier to determine than the other one. It's pretty much all in the yellow. Here's where the wind turbines are located here in Providence. So we're looking at about a 5 meters per second annual average wind speed if we're just going to assess it by using the map. But again, same thing as Buffalo Mountain. We have data from the wind farm is how well it did in its first year, looking at about 6,700 megawatt hours, and we determined a capacity factor of 17%. Each turbine is 1.5 megawatts, so we can figure out what the average hourly output is, which we found over here is 255 kilowatts. So let's take a look at the power curve again. If we're looking at 255 kilowatts and we come over here, we're looking at about, we'd say, you know, it can produce an average of 6 meters per second. So same story, with the NREL map at 5 meters per second, we come over here, it's going to produce well below 200 kilowatts, much, you know, less capacity factor. So actual output at NBC Field Point Wind Farm is at least 40% better than what you would be able to predict by just using the map. This next case study, we're looking at Puerto Rico. It's a little bit different. We looked at 2 different wind farms, and we weren't able to find as good information about how much these wind farms produce, so it's a little bit more of anecdotal evidence. But we'll be able to show you still how much better these wind farms are doing than what you might be able to assess from the map. So the first wind farm is Finca de Viento Santa Isabel. It began, both of these are fairly new, it began in 2012. We're looking at 44 megawatts with a total capacity of over 100 megawatts, and it was developed by Pattern Energy. The second one is Punta de Lima Wind Farm, which began in 2013. A little bit smaller, but we've got 13 turbines, and both of these are up and operating. So let's take a look at the map again. So this one is a little bit different. It's a much more outdated map, only at 50 meters, which these turbines are much closer to the 80-meter hub heights. And the wind power classification system down here is much more broad, so it makes it hard to gauge what the average wind speeds would be. So if we look over, oh, sorry, see if we can go back. So if we look over here, it looks like it's in the white area, which would be, and just for reference, the Santa Isabel is the diamond and Punta de Lima is the oval over here, but they're both kind of in the white area, which says it could be anywhere from 0 meters per second, which would make it purely undevelopable, to 5 to 9 meters per second. So suggests that these could be undevelopable with poor to marginal wind resource. So with the Finca de Vienta Santa Isabel wind farm, we couldn't find actual information about how much it produced in a year, but they did initial studies before the wind farm was constructed, which we find that's what really needs to be done, is a 1 to 2 year study of the wind speeds. And they reported to have an average wind speed of 6.5 meters per second. With the Punta de Lima wind farm, we found that the developer said that the wind farm will generate 52 gigawatts per year. So let's try the power curve and see what that shows us with the wind speed. So each turbine is 1.8 megawatts. We found a capacity factor of 25%. 25% of the 1.8 megawatts would put us at 450. So let's take a look. 450 would put us at about 6 meters per second wind speeds. So the summary from these two wind farms is that the average annual wind speeds are approximately 6 to 6.5 meters per second, which is so much better than what you can gauge from the map. And also imagine the potential. Simon talked about advanced turbine technology with taller hub heights. This could really produce even better potential for Puerto Rico. So we found a new, more advanced NREL report on the U.S. Virgin Islands that recognize that some of these areas in the Virgin Islands could achieve wind speeds of 7 to 7.5 meters per second. So our next case study is at the University of Delaware. They installed a 2 megawatt turbine on their campus in Lewes in 2010, and this turbine's been a great success, powering the campus with even a surplus of energy. Here's the map, NREL map at 80 meters at Delaware, and we can zoom in. The campus is over here. Here's where the wind turbine would be. So our estimate of the wind speeds is approximately 6 meters per second. And before the University of Delaware decided they wanted to construct this wind turbine or not, they conducted a feasibility report in 2009, which shows how crucial it is to really go and do on-the-ground measurements beforehand. And they looked at 80 meters and found that it would achieve approximately 6.74 meters per second. So here's information from the report that they did that you can access online, and they also assessed what the annual energy output might be. So they moved along with developing this wind turbine. And again, we have data that can help us determine what the actual wind speeds may be. So the report that they put out found that in about a year, they produced 5,100 megawatt hours of electricity, which is even better than they had estimated from the report the year before. And that this would give them a capacity factor of 29%. So let's go back to the power curve again. We're looking at 580 kilowatts, and we come down at about 7 meters per second. So same story, we're looking at just a 1 meter per second difference, but it makes a huge difference on the amount of electricity that you can produce in a year. So if we were looking at closer to 6, you can see what the production would be from the wind turbine. Sorry about that. And we can see that the capacity factor would only be 15 to 20%. So the output was about double as we could predict from the map. So here's our last case study. It's a little bit more unique. We're not actually looking at turbines, but this helps us kind of look into the future at advanced turbine technology. And I think it kind of demonstrates the Southeast opportunity with new turbines and kind of shows us a better idea of what's needed to do an extensive on-the-ground study before developing a wind farm. So AWS True Power performed an extensive study in 2011 on Arkansas's wind resource. They used 5 different communication towers ranging from 90 to 120 meters for wind monitoring. And they were then able to estimate long-term mean wind speeds. So one of the big takeaways from the report, they found that the long-term projected speeds at a height of 80 meters and above suggests that commercial wind development in these areas of the state is feasible, and they recognize, the technological advances in the industry. So here is the study that AWS True Power performed. If you look over here, these are the 5 different towers that they used to get the wind speeds. And this is the big part, the big takeaway. So they look at 80 meters, and that's the one that NREL is using for the maps. But they also look at 100, 120, and 150. And you can see the change in the meters per second. And it might just go up half a meter per second, 1 meter per second. But now we understand from looking at the power curves how much more electricity can be produced. So let's look at this map one more time. And I just picked one of the towers so that we could look and compare. So this is the ARK1 tower. And from looking at just the NREL map, we would be predicting about a 6 to 6.5 meters per second average wind speed. Here again is the chart that we looked at earlier, and we're looking again at ARK1. So for about 80 meters, we're looking at 6.46 meters per second. So this is actually about in line with what NREL was predicting. But let's look at 100, 120, 150. As you can see, the meters per second greatly goes up, and it really changes the production. So lastly, these are different maps that AWS True Power put together from the report. And here's at 80 meters, 100, 120, and 150. And the darker the shades, the higher the wind speeds are. So you can really see how much more resources open up and the opportunities to develop wind farms if we increase the hub height with modern turbines. So increasing it increases capacity factors, as we've seen, increases annual output, and most importantly, decreases the cost. So conclusions and takeaways from this report, as Simon greatly highlighted, advanced turbine technology has allowed for greater capacity factors and lower costs. And now with new modern turbines, there's 134,000 megawatts potentially available throughout our region. With these new turbines, there's a need for wind resource maps that better reflect these opportunities. And we can't just use wind speed maps alone. They can be used to initially assess a site, but we need to go in. That's why developers go and do an extensive 1 to 2 year study on the ground. The big issues with the maps, first, as Simon explained, there are 2 cores to identify ridge resources that might have pockets of really good wind speed. And for the Southeast in particular, they're outdated, only with 80 meter hub heights. And the case studies have shown, as we've said, that 1 meter per second difference in average annual wind speeds makes a significant difference in the electricity that can be produced in a year. And lastly, the majority of the case studies that we found showed that turbines produce double what would be expected from the maps. So I think that concludes the report. Thank you everyone for getting on. I guess we'll open it up for questions. And if you have any particular questions on our calculations or on the sources that we use, feel free to email me here. It's Allie@cleanenergy.org.
Great job, Allie. And I just wanted to remind folks, if you have any questions, there is a question box available to you that you can type in your question, and we'll get to them as the order comes to us. First question that we've got here, generators on top of skyscrapers. At one time, it seemed like a great idea. What happened? So, Allie, do you want to take a first stab?
I'm not sure if I totally understand the question.
Okay. Well, I think the premise of this was the idea was you could put a wind turbine on top of a skyscraper, and the theory behind it is nice because, again, the higher you go up into the air, the higher you get into the atmosphere, the greater the wind speed. So if you've ever been in a skyscraper and you've been able to go outside at a very high floor level, you'll notice that the wind speed up high is much stronger than what it is on the ground floor, even being outside. The problem with the idea of putting a wind turbine on a skyscraper is that the engineers and the developers of that skyscraper didn't take into consideration putting a wind turbine on the top. So now you've got this additional load that the skyscraper would have to deal with, not only the weight, but also although the torque from the turbine itself it would just not make the skyscraper engineered soundly enough in order for it to be safe to operate. So that's part of the explanation there. And it's very similar. I get this question a lot. Why don't we put wind turbines on old abandoned oil wells out in the Gulf of Mexico? Well, again, the rigs that were designed were not designed to hold that type of structure, and as such, they may not be safe.
Thanks. And Simon, I will add though, while you do have a very good point about that, there's actually a hotel in Fort Lauderdale that has, I think they're vertical, am I right? It's a different kind of wind turbine, but it's on the roof of the hotel. So while we find that this isn't usually technology that we would use, it's been a success and has helped the hotel to reduce their energy consumption.
Yes, in some small cases you might be able to do it, but the turbines that we're talking about here are utility scale, and the turbines that Ali mentioned, thank you for mentioning that, the hotel in Fort Lauderdale, those turbines are considerably smaller, but we've written about it before on our blog, so feel free to check it out. It's kind of a neat little application, but again, we're trying to focus a bit more on the utility scale turbines.
Definitely.
The next question we have here says, you can't confidently calculate average power from average wind speed using a power curve. This ignores the shape of the wind speed distribution. Ali, could you talk a little bit more about the case studies and what the case studies are meant to show?
Yeah, sure. So, I know that this isn't the most extensive, but what we're really looking at is there's two big takeaways from this. The first is that you can't just use these maps to initially, you use them to initially assess, but you can't just use these maps to determine if it's a good place to develop wind farms. And the maps are too coarse to really determine where there's pockets of good wind speed. So we're just using this as sort of initial assessment to show the need for new wind speed maps and to show that there's a need to go in and really extensively review the sites. So yeah, that's the big takeaway.
Right, and I just want to reiterate, Ali really stressed, and we don't mean to suggest that this means that when developers can go out and not conduct their on-site surveys. They need to conduct their on-site surveys to get the best picture of actually what's going on the ground. 4 of the case studies that we looked at are real-world built turbines or wind projects. And so the data that we were able to receive from them from publicly available areas already take into consideration some of the losses associated with things like turbine wake or transmission reductions and those sorts of things. And so by comparing the real-world case studies against the power curves of the turbines that they used, it can provide a bit more of a guide to indicate that, as Ali was saying, we need to have more on-site surveys, but not to rely solely on the wind speed maps that we have available mostly to the public.
Right, and I think that it's obvious for a lot of us that you need to go do this on-site assessment, but these case studies really did show the difference.
Next question, how should the EPA account for both the new turbine technology as well as the older maps in its 111D rule?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought in the EPA, and we've been looking really closely at the Clean Power Plan. And what we're finding from what EPA is using to estimate wind resource potential is they're actually looking at NREL's 80-meter wind speed maps. And so, as Simon already explained, there's so much more potential if you look at modern turbine technology. So what we're encouraging EPA to do is to look at the new numbers that were presented, that Simon presented at the beginning. And we think this will really open up the potential and can show that wind energy can be a big part of the state's plans.
Great. Let's see here. Have you produced a written report that is available to the public? Yes, it's available online today. I think Ali has written a blog about it, so go check out the cleanenergy.org blog, and we will do our best to make sure that not only that everybody has access to this presentation, but also we can get you the link to that white paper as well.
Yeah, if you go onto our website, it's www.cleanenergy.org and click on news and reports, then it should be the first one available.
The
And we
next
also, sorry, just wanted to add, Simon, that we've also made these case studies available as sort of separate fact sheets if you're interested in one in particular and want to share that one.
Next question is, how do you expect to convince your utilities in the regulated South to change? And I think really what we're seeing here, and again, this was one of the very first things that we mentioned, was that a lot of the utilities are voluntarily buying wind energy from out of the region because it is the cheapest thing to purchase. And that's definitely a trend that we hope to continue to see, that the utilities are doing it because it's the best thing for their operations and for their customers. So as wind turbine technology continues to advance, the prices will continue to decline, and as such, the utilities will hopefully make an economic choice. The purpose of this webinar, again, is to try and provide the newest updated information available to folks so that when you hear things like, oh, wind energy is too expensive, well, that's wrong. It's not true anymore. In fact, it's one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest, form of new power generation that a utility could purchase. Or things such as, oh, well, the wind doesn't blow in the South. Well, that's not true anymore. In fact, we have better turbines and better resource assessments to determine that, well, yes, it does. And so part of it is just getting past this older misinformation that's out there and just really highlighting the benefits of these newer technologies. Let's see here. Do you have any information or comments on construction logistic issues with taller towers and larger rotors? And it goes on, the question goes on to say, as of a few years ago, there were very few cranes in the US that could build turbines with hubs over 100 meters. There's also been issues with roads and the required turbine turning radius for the longer blades. And this is a problem. It's more difficult to move larger machines around using the current infrastructure. But there are some advancements that are occurring. One of them is an idea that you can use a space frame tower and wrap it so that you don't have basically an open lattice work visually available or available for birds to roost in, but you could wrap it. And using that space frame technology, you don't have to haul the very, very large monopole pieces across the roads, and it makes it a little bit easier to construct things on site. But it is an issue. So as the industry starts to move towards these larger turbines, I think it's just going to be a matter of supply and demand. The more demand we have for these larger turbines, the more the industry is going to have to respond to try and deal with some of these limitations. Next question, wouldn't it make more sense to focus the Southeast on solar instead of wind? Is there any analysis about the comparative efficiencies between both power sources for the Southeast?
I'll take this first, Simon. I
Sure.
think, what we're looking at is it's not one or the other. I think solar and wind can work really well together in the Southeast. So what we're seeing is in, the evenings and in the morning, wind energy is really peaking, and in the hot, afternoons, we find that solar is producing really well. So I think if we want to see a renewable energy future that works really well in our region, we can use both of the resources.
Excellent. And here's a related question. Did you look at diurnal variation? How does it compare to load? And we didn't look at that. The information we have are annual energy output and annual capacity factors. And so we didn't look at the morning versus the afternoon versus springtime, wintertime, or fall time energy output. But that's definitely something the developers have to look at and that the utilities need to know in order to adequately prepare for wind energy development in their portfolio. The next one is, in Alabama, a wind energy project has been stalled because of citizen opposition to having huge turbines installed on Lookout Mountain, a popular tourist destination. How are newer turbines quieter?
Right. So going into that Alabama wind farm, I think what was really needed was education about the opportunities for wind energy and the opportunities that bigger wind farms can provide for our region. So we're finding that A 600-foot tall wind turbine can provide power for 600 homes. But Simon, do you want to explain a little bit more about how they're quieter?
Yeah, sure. Well, the turbines themselves have substantially advanced since the 1980s when they did have a bad reputation for being loud and squeaky and that sort of thing. But the turbines nowadays, if they are squeaking or making a noise, usually it's because there's some sort of malfunction that needs to be fixed. So it's very similar to a car. If your car is running at peak efficiency, there's very little obtrusive noise associated with it. But the heart of the question here is regarding tourism. And we've actually done a bit of research to find that turbines can actually act as tourist destinations. And in fact, there's a really good wind farm in Atlantic City where people actually request to go visit the turbines, even though the turbines are sited on a wastewater treatment facility. And I think they get something like 15,000 visitors per year. So people actually want to see the wind turbines. It's not necessarily that it'll scare people away. And in fact, it may actually create some new tourist opportunities.
Right, and also, I mean, we're also seeing the tourist opportunities here in the southeast at the Buffalo Mountain Wind Farm. They actually have a park right outside the wind farm that they called Wind Rock Park, and folks go and pay to view the turbines and to camp. So it can really work in harmony with the communities, and we've actually seen, economic opportunities with tourism.
Next question we've got here. Do you have information on potential for increased issues with wind shear as turbine swept area increases? No, we didn't look at that for this study. We can probably put you in touch with some wind developers that are having to deal with increased wind shear and what it may mean for production at the wind turbines, but no, we didn't look at that in this study. And are there any other questions for folks? We do have one more here. It says, are you all working at all to create new higher resolution maps? No.
So, yeah, we are not, but have been hearing from NRail that they are working on doing some more updated maps. So hopefully we'll be seeing those soon and we can better show folks the opportunity for wind energy in the region.
That's right. And the maps themselves can be quite expensive to generate and create. And that's part of the reason why the National Renewable Energy Labs are constricted in what they can show, because they basically have to create maps for the entire country. And when you create individualized state maps, it becomes a very expensive process. And so one way to reduce the expense of that process is by making the maps a little bit more fuzzy to make the resolution not nearly as good. But again, you ultimately end up getting what you pay for. So with less resolution, you can't quite see all the opportunities available. And so again, the point that we're trying to make is that you can't determine whether or not a wind project is a good idea or not based solely on these wind maps. The maps are good resources to kind of begin a discussion, but basing an entire decision either by a wind project developer or, as we've seen in Alabama, opposition to a wind project because the maps don't show what you think they need to show is not really good policy. Another question we've got here is, you haven't mentioned offshore wind. What are the problems there? Allie?
Yeah, so I actually just got back from an offshore wind conference in Atlantic City, and what we've seen is there is tremendous opportunity for our region with offshore wind. There's more stable and consistent winds, and we can have even greater heights in turbines. And even with the southeast, what's cool is we have a really shallow seaboard that goes pretty far out. But I think the current issues right now is cost. So taking a cable and going all the way back to the land is pretty expensive. But what's exciting is hopefully starting in 2015, the next year, we'll be seeing steel in the water with new turbines from Cape Wind and another wind farm called Block Island off of Rhode Island. So I think once we begin to see offshore wind farms actually taking place in the US, they've been happening for about 20 years now in Europe, but once we get that industry going, we'll hopefully see the costs start to decline and hope to see some really tremendous opportunities for our region. I know that North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia are currently working on studying the resource.
And there's quite a few regulatory hurdles that we're still trying to figure out as not only a region but also a country. And so once we can figure out some of those regulatory hurdles, hopefully we can go forward. But again, the point of the work that we're doing here is responding to the fact that we have wind farm developers looking in just about every state in the South now. So we have knowledge of wind farms that are potential at this point in just about every state in the South, which is phenomenal and a huge change from things just in the past 5 years. So we wanted to try and look at, well, why are the developers here? The evidence that's available to the public, again, the publicly available maps, they haven't changed in the past 5 years. And so what has changed in the past 5 years to make the developers reevaluate the South as the next frontier for wind energy? And it's these new turbines. That's predominantly what's driving it. That we have new opportunities available to us because the turbines are so much better than what they were even 5 years ago. And we have one last question about hurricanes and offshore wind farms. Allie?
Yeah, sure. So there's been a lot of studies that have looked at hurricanes, and what we found is that wind farms can stand up to a category. Is it 3 or 4, Simon?
It's a high category 3.
High category 3, right? And we've seen so far with let's say Sandy that the wind farms over there were not impacted. So and when we're saying high category 3, that means the eye of that high category 4, whatever we're looking at, really would have to hit the middle of the wind farm. So it's something that they're continuing to study and look into more. But these turbines can withstand pretty high wind speeds.
And they're specifically designing the turbines to mirror the environment that they're in to be protected. Each turbine itself is a multi-million-dollar investment, and so developers don't want them to be toppled over at the risk of a hurricane. And so it's a matter of engineering and also insurance. And it's not just for offshore wind farms, but coastal wind farms as well. And what Ali was alluding to, we have quite a few coastal wind farms in this country that have been constructed and have survived quite well through hurricanes. And so one of the examples, again, we've got this wind farm in Atlantic City, New Jersey. It's right there, very close to the boardwalk itself, and it survived quite well through Sandy. The Delaware turbine that Ali was looking at with our case studies, that turbine is again right on the coast, and that turbine survived not only Sandy but also Irene a few years prior. And then we've got an awful lot of turbines from New Jersey on north up through Maine, and we've got some case studies that show that those turbines performed as they should, and they shut down when they were supposed to and were turned back on when they were supposed to. So a lot of the case studies that we're seeing is that they're not hurricanes are not nearly as big as a threat as what they may be made out to be. So the perception is that they would be, but really they're not that big of a deal yet. Okay, well with that, I think we're pretty much done. But again, thanks for everybody for jumping on the webinar, and we will do our best to get slides, the presentation, and the report out to folks that were able to join us.
And again, here's my email if you have any other questions.
Erin, did you want to close this out?
Oh, yes, sure. Yep, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ali and Simon. That was a great presentation. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. Today's presentation has been recorded, and it will be available on the webinar archive page of our website. We'll also send you a link to that recording once it has been processed. We appreciate your support and interest and hope that you'll join us again. And we will be sending a follow-up in the next few days with all of the information that Simon just talked about. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.